migrating from Jenkins LTS to CloudBees CI. Here's today's starting point. I have a Jenkins LTS controller version 2.387.3. It's currently running on Alma Linux 8, and Jenkins LTS was installed via RPM. Let's take a look at the documentation for how to migrate from Jenkins LTS over to CloudBees CI. The link to this documentation is down in the description, and just like any migration document, you have some pre-tasks to do. So we're going to take a look at each of these items, and then I may or may not do them in my case, but in your case, I would recommend that you follow every one of these pre-tasks. First off, as all migrations carry a risk of data loss, CloudBees recommends backing up your Jenkins home directory prior to doing any migrations. That's just a good idea. Step 0, always back up. Also, you probably should be doing this in a test environment first prior to doing this just live in production without ever having done it before. So set up a test environment, make it look like production, do your upgrade, shake out any of the processes so that when you actually do it in production, you shouldn't be surprised by anything that may or may not happen. Next up, make sure that the version of Java that you're using to run Jenkins matches the Java versions that are allowed for CloudBees CI. There's a link right here, supported platforms for CloudBees CI on traditional platforms. So if we open that up in a new tab, at the time of recording, the only supported versions of Java, or specifically the JDK, is JDK 11. So not Java 8 and also not Java 17. So you must be running Java 11 on your Jenkins LTS in order to migrate over to CloudBees CI. So if you're running Java 17 on your Jenkins LTS controller, you're going to need to downgrade that to Java 11. Let's go back over to our list. One of the other things that I sort of skipped over in the second point is before you start the migration, you'll want to go through and disable all jobs on your Jenkins LTS controller. That way, once you've finished the migration, you can start enabling jobs to make sure they're working fine for you after the migration. Now let's move on to the next big point. Plugins that you're using may need to be removed, upgraded, or even in certain cases, downgraded. CloudBees recommends using the plugin versions that are in the CloudBees Assurance program. Now we'll see in our example that downgrades actually do make a difference. So we'll see that in a few moments. Be aware there are differences between the Jenkins configuration as code and configuration as code that is in CloudBees CI. So in my case, the way I've set up my controller, I did not have any cask used to set up the controller, so therefore I don't have to worry about that as I'm migrating over to CloudBees CI. If you're currently using JCask, you're going to need to check out the differences between JCask and cask for CloudBees CI. And finally, we recommend that you install the Jenkins Health Advisor on your Jenkins controller prior to doing the migration, just to make sure that there aren't any things that could be fixed right now on Jenkins LTS that will help mitigate any kinds of issues that may show up on CloudBees CI. So in summary, for the pre-task, each of these 6 items matter. So if you're moving from Jenkins LTS over to CloudBees CI, we recommend, again, going through each of these steps in detail to make sure when you do make that migration that we're getting ready to do, you've protected yourself as much as possible prior to making the migration. Okay, let's go ahead and assume that I've done all of these steps. Now we're down to the section for migrating to CloudBees CI on traditional platforms. So what we're going to do, the very first step is we go in to find the instance ID. Now, why do you need the instance ID? CloudBees CI is a licensed product, and therefore you're going to need a license, and that's based on the instance ID of your Jenkins controller. So if I go ahead and copy this item here and go back into the controller, I'll go to Manage Jenkins, and I'll click on Script Console here at the bottom, paste that in, and click on Run. And then what you'll see from the output of this is some string. You would copy this string, and then you would, according to the documentation here, send an email to csm-help@cloudbees.com and request a license for this specific instance ID. Now, in my example today, I'm going to be using a trial license, so I'm not going to have the actual license file to do the installation in this example. What we want to do is we want to let all running builds complete before you start the migration. So if you think about it, I want everything to be silent on this controller. One thing that you may want to do as well, if we go back into Manage Jenkins, we can already see that I don't have any jobs currently running. But the other thing I would go ahead and do is prepare for shutdown. So the reason is migration, and I'm going to click on Prepare for Shutdown. That way, no other jobs will get scheduled on this controller. I want everything to be completely silent. No jobs running, nothing else happening prior to doing the shutdown, because once we do the shutdown of the Jenkins LTS controller, we're going to be doing a backup. So we need to have that Jenkins home directory in as pristine of a state as possible. Let's go back over to our documentation. What we're ready to do now is go ahead and stop the service. So I'm going to go back into my shell here, and I'm going to say systemctl stop Jenkins. Now I also want to hedge my bets against this server actually being rebooted during this process. So I'm also going to say systemctl disable Jenkins, because right now my Jenkins service is set up to auto restart on server restart. So I want to make sure that that Jenkins service does not start again. Let's go back over to the documentation. So we've done step 3. Next up, we would back up our Jenkins home directory. Now in my case, my Jenkins home directory is in var lib Jenkins. So I take that directory and back up that whole directory and move it off of this server, just for safekeeping. So next up, we need to get the CloudBees CI installation type of my choice. Now remember that my Jenkins LTS had been installed via RPM, and I want to go ahead and install CloudBees CI via RPM. So I'm going to click on the documentation for downloads, and I'm going to look for CloudBees CI on traditional platforms. Now I'm also going to look at past releases. Remember, my version of Jenkins LTS was 2.387.3. So I want to make sure that I install the similar version of CloudBees CI. So if I click on past releases so I can see all of the releases that I can install and click on RPM, what I can see here is that the closest version that matches mine of 2.387.3 is 2.387.3.3. So I'm going to be installing this specific version. But prior to installing this version, I need to set up my repository, set up the key, and then I can make sure as well that I'm going to specify this version. I don't want to take the latest version, even though in my case at the time of recording, this is the latest version. I want to specify the version. So let's go ahead and go over into our shell. Now, before I start doing the upgrade, let's figure out which version of Java I have. So I'm going to say java-version. And we can see that I have the Tamarin version 11.0.19. So remember, I need Java 11 in order to run CloudBees CI. So I have Java 11, so I'm good there. If I go back over to the documentation here, I need to do a wget to pull in the repository definition. I'm also going to do my RPM import for the key. And then since I'm on Alma Linux, I'm going to be using DNF instead of yum. So I'll say DNF install. I'm going to do CloudBees core CM, but then I'm going to specify 2.387.3.3. That way I'm pulling in the version of CloudBees CI that is most similar to the version of Jenkins LTS. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And now that the installation is completed, let's see if it's running. So we'll say ps auxww. And I can see here right now that CloudBees CI is running. So I want to go ahead and stop that. So I'm going to say systemctl stop CloudBees core CM. Let's go back over to our documentation. So we've done the installation. So step 5 is complete. Now we need to migrate the settings from the Jenkins LTS config file, whether that's etc sysconfig, etc default if you're on Debian based or whatever, into the similar sysconfig that's for CloudBees CI. Now for Jenkins LTS, I had installed using systemctl. So if I look at systemctl edit Jenkins, we can see that I have a Java ops setup and a Jenkins ops setup. Now these environment variables, Java ops and Jenkins ops, are not the exact same environment variables within CloudBees CI. So let's see how we can map these over. So let's quit out of this and let's go ahead and edit the one for CloudBees CI, which is etc sysconfig CloudBees core CM. Now remember, our Jenkins home is in var lib Jenkins. We want to keep that in the same space. So I'm going to change var lib CloudBees core CM to var lib /Jenkins. We don't need to change Jenkins Java command. We don't need to change the Jenkins user here, but we're going to need to make a change using this user in just a few moments. We'll go on down to Jenkins Java options. Now this maps back to what we saw in our systemctl configuration for Java ops. So in my case, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and delete what's here, and I'm going to replace it with what I had over in my configuration. In my case, it still started with headless, but then I had a value for preferring IPv4 stack. I also had set up a temp dir. Now in this case, my temp dir before was varcache Jenkins temp, but now I've changed this to use varcache CloudBees core CM temp. So I'll need to create that temp directory before I start everything up. And then I also had 2 values for my time zones. So that's all I needed for my Java options because that matches what I had over in my systemctl config. Go ahead and scroll down some more. Port, we're going to leave 8080 the default. Nothing to change for HTTPS port, at least in my example. And then finally, at the very bottom, what we're going to see is another item that's called Jenkins args. Now, the Jenkins args maps back to the Jenkins ops. In my case, again, I had a varcache Jenkins plugins that I've changed here to varcache CloudBees Core CM plugins. So I've made 3 changes to this file so far. I set my Jenkins home directory to var libjenkins. I updated Jenkins args, and I also updated my Jenkins Java options. So let's go ahead and save this file as is. The next thing that I need to do, because I have my own temp directory running inside of varcache, is I need to create that directory. But since I'm root, I need to change the ownership of that directory. But I also need to go ahead and change the ownership of var libjenkins. If we cd over to var libjenkins, or actually just to var lib, and we take a look at the output here, what we'll see is our Jenkins directory, which is our Jenkins home directory, is owned by Jenkins, but now it needs to be owned by CloudBees Core CM. We're not going to be using varlib CloudBees Core CM. I'm just going to leave it here, but there should be no new files going into this directory. So effectively, that directory could be deleted after everything's been verified. So let's go ahead and go down to the bottom here, and we're going to change the ownership chown-r for CloudBees Core CM for both varcache CloudBees Core CM, which will cover our temp directory that we just created, and also var libjenkins. So if we hit enter here, and we take a look again at the ownership for Jenkins, we can see now that the var libjenkins directory is owned by CloudBees Core CM. Let's go back over to our documentation. Let's see how we're doing here. So we migrated the settings. If you're using RPM or deb, make sure the ownership of the Jenkins home directory matches the Jenkins user, which is what we just did. Now we're at the point to go ahead and start the new service. So we'll go back into our shell. We'll type systemctl start CloudBees Core CM. Now let's take a look at the logs for this starting up. So we'll go back into our shell here. We'll cd into var log CloudBees Core CM. Now how do I know that I need to go there? Let's check this out real quick. So we'll say ps aux ww. If we take a look at the startup line that is starting up CloudBees CI, we'll notice one line item here. Log file is going to var log CloudBees Core CM, CloudBees Core CM. So if I take a look at this file, I'll just do a less on it. Less CloudBees Core CM. Let's search for 2.387.3. Now we can see here that we have an entry for upgrading Jenkins. The last running version was 2.387.3. This version is 2.387.3.3, which is our CloudBees CI version. Then it goes through and actually does the upgrade or the migration from Jenkins LTS over to CloudBees CI. Let's go back over to our browser. We need to log in. Now you'll notice that it's asking for a license. This takes us back to the earlier using the instance ID to get a license. But in my case, I'm just going to request a trial license. Now I have a license. The next screen, it says install suggested plugins. So we'll click on that. What we'll see here is the banner is now changed from Jenkins to CloudBees CI. You'll also notice down in the footer that the CloudBees CI version number 2.387.3.3 is listed out. We can see that our jobs are here. That's good. Let's go ahead and double check our documentation again. So we've entered the license, we've signed in. Now we need to go to Manage Jenkins and then select Beekeeper Upgrade Assistant. So let's go do that. So Manage Jenkins. We'll go to Beekeeper Upgrade Assistant. Now also you'll notice a warning here. Beekeeper Upgrade Assistant detects issues. Okay, that's actually good. So we'll click into that. We also see that same banner here. Let's scroll down to find where the issue is. It's in plugins. So we'll click on More Info. And what we see here is that there are a number of plugins here that were on Jenkins LTS that have a version that's greater than the version that CloudBees CI expects to have based on the CloudBees Assurance Program. We can see that here from the action saying the plugin should be downgraded if you want this to be fixed automatically. So we can see here version 5.2.2.3 is currently installed, but 5.2.2.2 is what's expected. So what I'm going to do in order to make all of these work, now in this case, every one of these are all downgraded scenarios. So to make this easy for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to cap configuration. I'm going to check the box, allow automatic downgrades of plugins on restart. So I'm going to check the box and click on save. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and restart my controller. Now that we're back in, let's go back over to Manage Jenkins. We'll notice that we don't see the notification about problems with Beekeeper. We'll go back in here. We see everything's checked off green, but I want to go ahead and uncheck that box for automatically downgrading. So I'll go back in here and uncheck the automatic downgrade. Again, I wanted that just to be a one-off to get me back into a healthy state from a CloudBees Assurance Program perspective. So we'll click on Save. Let's go back to the documentation. So we've signed in, we've done our Beekeeper Assistant. We've already made sure that we're enrolled in CloudBees Assurance Program. If you want to see that, enroll this instance. That's there by default. Then let's go to Manage Jenkins, Manage Plugins. So we'll go back into Dashboard, Manage Jenkins, Manage Plugins, and we can see here that we don't have any available updates to actually install. In your case, you might. Okay, finally, let's go through here. No updates, no upgrades. At that point, we're good. Now we have post-migration steps to do. So we had the pre-migration steps to do. We've actually done the migration. Everything's looking pretty good. I'm starting to re-enable jobs, making sure they're working. But even prior to that, if I have SSH-based agents connected to my controller, I want to move those from using the standard SSH to using the NIO SSH-based connections that are available from CloudBees. If you want to understand more about what the NIO SSH agents mean, you can follow the documentation CloudBees SSH build agents. So let's go ahead and go over to our controller. I have one agent connected. So let's go into the agent. The first step that I want to do is I want to go ahead and disconnect this agent. So at this point, I no longer have an active connection to this agent. Let's go into Configure. Pretty much everything stays the same from this perspective. What I need to do under Launch method is change Launch Agents via SSH to Launch Agents via SSH using the non-blocking IO. At that point, it clears out a few things. So I just need to re-enter my host name. The credentials stay the same because I'm still connecting back to the same server. Now, previously, I was using a non-verifying strategy for just the SSH agents, but for the NIO, I want to select the non-verifying. You can choose whichever way you want to go. And then I want to go ahead and click on Save. Now, as this agent starts back up, I can take a look at the log. And what we can see here is that it's reconnecting back up. So if we click back into our dashboard, we can see that the agent is connected, and we can see now also here that the CloudBees SSH connector is the connection type being used. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to us on Twitter at CloudBees. If this video was helpful to you, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to CloudBees TV yet, why not? Take a moment, click on that subscribe button, and then ring that bell, and you'll be notified anytime there's new content available on CloudBees TV. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.